So, you have asked me what is bel canto. It's good you asked me this question at the beginning, because you have to begin, when you talk about bel canto, to define what the word means. There are many definitions going around, and people may be talking about very different things when they say the word. Bel canto, of course, if you translate it directly from the Italian, means beautiful singing. And that is part of what we are talking about. Everything has to be beautiful singing in bel canto. But actually, if you look into a music dictionary and get the official definition of bel canto, all the dictionaries say that bel canto is the style of singing which was developed in the Baroque times by the castrati. So it is actually the Baroque style of singing. But if you go to a theater today and they say they are going to do a bel canto opera, or this or that singer is a specialist in bel canto singing, is a bel canto singer, they mean something different. They mean the Italian opera from about 1800 to 1850, and especially the four big names of that epoch, which are Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, and also early Verdi. So practical people working in music, when they talk about bel canto, just mean the style which was used in this period. So you have three definitions: beautiful singing, the Baroque singing style, and the style which was used in Italy from 1800 to about 1850. So what we can do is to combine all three. What I am always talking about as a practical musician when I talk about bel canto is the style of the epoch of Bellini, Rossini, Donizetti. But the other definitions are also valid, because the very, very interesting and very important thing is that this style, even though it was in the Romantic period, was still the same style, or would be better to say the performance practice was still valid, still the same performance practice as in the old Baroque times. And that needs a bit of explanation, because this was only the case in Italy. In the other countries, especially in Germany, when the Baroque period stopped, even with Mozart and of course with Beethoven, there was nothing Baroque more into that. But in Italy, for some reason, this way of looking at opera and the whole attitude continued up to the middle of the 19th century. And that is something which many people don't understand, that you can't work on an Italian opera of this epoch the same way you work on an opera of a later time or on a German opera of the same period. But in any case, it's important to know, when you ask what is bel canto, before I start explaining a lot of things, to know basically what we're talking about. And we are talking about the style which was used in Italian opera from about 1800 to 1850. Another question, of course, is why do you have to learn this style, or why do I have to give courses on bel canto? That has several reasons. One is, of course, that it is a historical epoch. It's not our way of feeling today, or for most people. So it is something you have to learn. You have to get into the culture of the time and the basic way of feeling of people at that time. But there are some more specific reasons. One of the big characteristics of the bel canto style is that the performer was much more creative than in later times. You could say that when an opera was being performed, the performer was maybe not equally, but very much also participating in it as the composer did. A performance of a bel canto opera, or the creation of a bel canto opera, takes place on the evening when one singer sings this music and does things he wants to do with it. And that also means even changing the notes, singing things which are not in the score. And this is very hard for today's people to understand, because a music student today usually learns, I am a good performer, player, singer, if I do exactly what's in the score. And now someone comes and says, if you want to do what the composer wanted you to do, please don't do what is in the score. And that is a big revolution and very hard for people to understand. And it takes a lot of courage to dare to do something which is not in the score for today's students or today's singers. And that is why you have to learn this style and learn a lot of specific things, but also learn why it has to be like this. Why should you not sing what is in the score? So that is the answer to the first question, what is bel canto? And also, I think, to the second, why do you have to learn it, and why do I do courses on it? Let's try to understand a bit what the difference is between bel canto and styles of other countries, like German opera of the time, or later styles like late Verdi or Puccini in Italy. Verismo, we call that the style of about 1900 to 1920, 1930, which is very, very different than bel canto. I think to understand the difference between bel canto and the other styles, it is good to go to the origin, which is Baroque music. People know a lot about Baroque music nowadays. It's very popular. And so I will just say some very basic things, which I think everyone knows anyway. But Baroque music is basically an ornamental style. It uses all kinds of small ornaments like the trills and different small things and scales. It's not a simple line, but it's an ornamental line. It's the same as in architecture. If you go to a Baroque church, you know it is Baroque not because of the basic plan of the church, but because of all the ornaments in it. The second thing is that the Baroque style is in a certain way an artificial style. In the Baroque, you don't express an emotion directly, but you use special means of expression for showing what you want to express. I think this is very clear when you think of the statues in the churches or in the paintings, who are often doing some very strange motions, which look for us a bit artificial. But it was at that time a kind of language which was used by all artists, and all the people looking at these statues or paintings understood what was meaning, what the artist was meaning by this. It was the same in music. Instead of just having a melody which is the direct expression of the emotion, they would use special phrases to express things. I said phrases, but I like the expression also means of expression, kinds of phrasing. We will get into this more in detail later, to express the emotion. So it is an ornamental style, and it is, in addition, a kind of artificial style which doesn't say the thing directly, but through special means of expression. The third thing I have already mentioned, that in Baroque music, as opposed to today's music, today's classical music, the performer was taking part in the creation of the piece. The composer at that time wrote, it was actually called uno scheletro, a skeleton, the printed score or the written score. He just wrote down the basic things he wanted you to do, but left a lot of things for the performer to do in the evening. And that is not because the composer was lazy. It is not because the performer was conceited or vain and wanted to make himself be more important than the composer. It is just part of the whole concept. We go to a performance at that time to hear the score, what the composer wrote, but also to hear what the singer or the performer, in our case the singer, what the singer will be doing on this evening, what he will be adding and changing. And very connected to this is the old basic form of the Baroque opera, which is the da capo aria. Da capo means start from beginning again, from the head. And the da capo aria is a three-piece aria where you have a big first main section, then there is a middle section, and then there is just a complete repeat of the first section. And in the music, the composer did not even write out the repeat. He just said da capo, which means take it from the beginning again. And you just had the same notes in front of you for the second time. And that is because he left it completely open to the performer to do his own version of this section when it was repeated. And so here you have the whole principle of the performer recreating the piece again when it is repeated. So that is the third basic characteristic of the Baroque music, that the performer was much more important than in later music, and he was really being creative and taking part in the creation of the work. So you can say that the piece was created every evening again and again in a different way. Yeah, and what you have to understand now is that whereas in most of the countries, Germany is the second big musical country, of course, Germany, Austria, whereas in Germany, with the end of the Baroque epoch, all these things disappeared, and the composers started to write down exactly what they wanted you to do. Beethoven is more or less like this, also Weber, all the earlier German composers after the Baroque time. Italy had a special tradition. For some reason, Italy was very, very conservative on the opera area, and all these principles of the Baroque epoch continued in Italy. So the Italian opera is still on these three basic things, even in the middle of the 19th century, that it is an artificial style, it is an ornamental style, and that the performer is expected to do things in the evening which are not in the score. I like to call this lecture, when I gave it in many different places, make a kind of subtitle for the lecture, which was Bel canto, or Why Do You Not Sing What Is in the Printed Score? To really shock today's people who think a good musician is the one who does exactly what's in the score. You have to turn that around completely when you get to the Bel canto. So these main principles of the Baroque singing are still valid in our epoch, but we are not in the Baroque anymore, of course. Between 1800 and 1850, we are also in Italy in the Romantic epoch. So we have to talk about a Romantic style which still took over the basic principles of Baroque singing. So it is different, because the Romantic music and Romantic opera had a very different way of expressing things and was also expressing different emotions. Just to give one example, if you think of the lieto fine, the happy end, which was a kind of requirement in the old Baroque opera seria, it had to have a nice ending, pleasant and positive. And then you think of the typical Romantic operas like Lucia di Lammermoor, where most of the people are dead, full of blood, and half of them get crazy. That is a typical Romantic opera. So it is a completely different way of feeling and different things to express. But the unique thing is that they were still using these principles and the means of expression coming from the Baroque times. And that is our bel canto opera. If we today talk about bel canto opera, which is Bellini, Rossini, Donizetti, it is romantic subjects, romantic emotions, using the language, the same language as they did use in the old Baroque opera. And that is actually only in Italy. It is a special thing, and that people have to just try to understand when they sing these Italian operas of the epoch, that you can't approach them in the same way you approach, for example, a German opera by Beethoven, Weber, or early Wagner. So we have talked about some of the basic principles of the bel canto, and let's go to some other ones. I think the very, very most important principle is that in bel canto there is always a priority of the singing. This is a typical Italian thing. Even in older times, if we go back to Mozart's times, for example, the German Austrian composers had a much more complicated orchestra part, and also the vocal line was more sophisticated, I would say, than in the Italian operas. It was just a typical thing of Italian opera that the vocal line was always in the foreground, was always the main thing. If you look at the bel canto composer par excellence, that is Bellini, you often have in the orchestra nothing more than and in the next place it will be changed to, and then you have the famous in early Verdi, this accompaniment, which some people laugh about. It is nothing to laugh about. It is a completely different attitude. This says to the audience, I step back, and now everything belongs to the singer, which is a completely different attitude than in all of the, for example, German opera, even starting with Mozart. So this signalizes that everything is put into the vocal line, and the singer is absolutely in the middle of everything, the most important person. This has a lot of effects on what is happening. One effect is that singing must always be beautiful. The bel canto operas make their effect through technically perfect and very beautiful singing. So you should not do anything which is not good singing in the bel canto opera, as opposed to later styles when you can do all kinds of things which a bit get off of singing. In the verismo operas you can even shout and speak and this kind of thing, whereas in the bel canto opera everything has to be expressed through beautiful singing. It also means that the singer is completely in the center of everything. He is the only one really expressing something. The orchestra is just helping him a little bit. So the singer has a completely different value than in, let's say, in later Verdi or in Wagner, Richard Strauss, where the orchestra is very important and the orchestra is saying half of what is going to be, what has to be said. So this has the effect, because the singing is the center of everything. This has the effect, number one, that the singing has to be very, very good. There are many singers around who can sing all kinds of different styles but cannot sing bel canto because their technique is not perfect or the beauty of the voice is not equal in all areas. And it also means that the singer has to do a lot of things himself, which in other styles, especially in later music, the orchestra will do for him, because as you saw, there is almost no orchestra going on. The singer is completely alone. And that is why in bel canto, the singer must use a whole series of means of expression, which you don't use in other styles, to express the emotion which is going to be expressed. Like the portamento, for example, you don't sing Io t'amo, I love you, that is dry, has no meaning, but you sing a portamento is Io t'amo, and this pulling through gives the emotion. Or the messa di voce, which is starting a note very, very softly, making a slow crescendo, and going back to nothing. Like in the beginning of one famous Bellini aria, the text is Eccomi, which you speak like that. You must sing Eccomi, and put your whole heart and the whole expression into this one note. That is the messa di voce. And many, many other kinds. There's a whole catalogue of means of expressions which you use in this style. They all come from the Baroque time, but were used up to 1850, and even later sometimes in Italian opera. And And then it also means that in bel canto, the singer is much more important. Here's actually the only important thing, as opposed to other styles. If you think of Wagner or Richard Strauss or Puccini or the late Verdi, where the orchestra starts to get very complicated, and you could say that the orchestra is at least equally as important than the singer. Whereas in bel canto, you have just this in the orchestra, which is not because the composers didn't have fantasy. It is just the principle of bel canto that everything is just the heart of the singer, what the heart of the singer is expressing through singing. Because the singer is in the middle of everything, he is still expected to be creative, and that is why, as in the Baroque time, the composers did not write down everything, but left a lot of freedom to the singer to actually compose. In a bel canto opera, the singer is not just reproducing the score, he is expected to compose things. The farther you get on in time, the more the composer starts writing down himself. And at one point you get to the point where Verdi starts saying, I want you to sing what I've written and nothing else. Wagner said that from the very beginning, more or less even Beethoven. But in these early operas, also earlier Verdi, there were just special places where he purposely did not write down what you want to sing and left it open to the singer. And that was the joy of a performance of the audience, to go in and see what is the singer going to do in these places tonight. And it was even so that they mostly still improvised, so they would do different things on the different evenings. So every performance of a bel canto opera at that time was different. Depended on what the singer wanted to do, what he could do. If he was tired, he would do less. If he was in good shape, he would do more complicated things. And we have to understand that is not an arrogance of the singers changing the score. It is part of the concept, and it is what the composer expected to be done. If the singer did not add things, the composer would have been, I'm sure, angry and said, but why are you doing nothing? I didn't want you to sing just ba, 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 as in the score, but to compose in this place. There were certain places where there was this creative aspect of singing was expected. It is the fermata. When you have the fermata sign, the singer was expected to start composing or improvising in the evening. There is a basic principle that in the bel canto opera, you never say anything twice, which is actually quite clear, because if I say something twice, I say it the second time with a different meaning, a different expression, otherwise I would not repeat it. So if you have a repeat in the bel canto operas where the notes are the same, this is a sign that you are expected to do a variation, and the composer kind of gives it onto you to start composing and make your own changes. And this is part of the joy of the performance, just to see what is the singer going to do this evening, or what does this singer do, which the last singer did not do. So all the repeats are a place where the singer was expected to do his own things. And then also these final cadenzas, which some people not familiar with the style kind of laugh about, when you have very often these before the opera stops. This is, of course, just to give you a good feeling. A cadenza is always satisfying. And I'm back home. But it is also to give the singer here, at the end of the piece, where the emotion and the expression is at a climax, the possibility to do something on his own. And the idea was that he should do what he could do the best, because that makes the best effect, and that also the composer wanted, for the music to have a big effect. So when you have these repeats, the singer was expected to sing something like, or whatever, and find out or improvise every evening these variations in these places. It is still the same thing with the high notes, which often or mostly were not written at that time. The composer would often write something very fancy, so, and then just ba, ba for stopping, which makes no effect at all, of course. And he expected the singer to go to some more interesting note, which had more power in it, like singing. But they often didn't write that down, because every different singer had different good high notes, and one would do this way, one that way, and that was also completely free and open for the singer. So as you see, you could say the basic main principle of the bel canto singing is that the singer has to be much more creative and really has to be able to compose, as opposed to later styles or the German style of the same epoch, where the composer wrote down all the notes he wanted you to sing. And that is not the case in the bel canto style. Connected to this, of course, is how a bel canto opera was created. That was also very different than what you imagine today. We imagine a composer maybe not even being asked to compose, but just having an idea, and then he sits down for 20 years and reads a lot of books and philosophizes and starts writing down his ideas and elaborating them for decades. Very different at that time. That was a kind of producing merchandise. If good or bad, it was like this. Even at Mozart's time, even with Mozart, you have to add, even with a great, great, great genius. So in the bel canto time, for example, Rossini, he would write in 1 year maybe 6 operas. And to compose the opera, he often had not more than 2 or 3 weeks. This is not a legend, this is documented. That he would often get be asked by the theater to compose an opera. The next step was, of course, that he would go to the theater and get to know the singers, so he would know what kind of music would he write for these voices. Many people today will say, oh, that is superficial. Why doesn't he write what comes to his mind as a great genius and expect the singers to sing it? That is completely against the principle of the bel canto, because the composer wanted it to sound good. And how could a music which is primarily singing sound good if the singer can't sing it well? This is just being practical. So he would go to the theater, get to know the singers, and then start writing the music. We have a lot of contracts, original contracts of the epoch, like for the Barbiere di Siviglia, most famous Rossini opera, where they really say in the contract, Rossini is required to come to the theater to get to know the singers, and it's in the contract that he is required to write his music according to the desires of the singers, so that the singers will be able to sing it well. And that's nothing bad, it is just very, very practical, as things were at that time. So they had a very short time. Imagine having 2 weeks to write Il Barbiere di Siviglia. The score is this thick. Someone actually said if you would put someone down copying this score, he could not copy it in this time, in which Rossini invented the music and wrote it down. So he left a lot of things open and did not put them in the score, because he knew, number one, he would decide what the singer should sing only after he got to know them very well, and he would continuously be changing and talking to them and trying things out until he got to a kind of final version for this performance. And then he just did not have time to really stipulate all these things. And then it was expected also that the singer had the freedom to add a lot of things himself. And so this is important to know. When you take a bel canto opera score, what is written down there is not necessarily what the composer at the end said you should sing. He may have changed a lot of things after that. In any case, he changed things when he went to do another performance with different singers. He would usually rewrite the piece completely, small things, or even compose new pieces because the singers were different. And he just wanted it to be sung well, and so he had to adapt it to the voice of the singers. Someone said in a very good way that there is no authentic version of a bel canto opera, there are as many authentic versions as the composer prepared performances. Every performance, every production was different. And so that is also important to know. It is very different than our way of thinking. You take the score, that is sacred, do what is here in the score. That also means that if the composer was living today and knew today's singers, he would continuously be recomposing his work to adapt it to these singers. So we do have a lot of freedom to adapt things also today to the voice of the singers. Yeah, this may give a kind of basic idea of how different this style is than what we are used to thinking of as a score which you take and just play or sing as it's in there, and then you have a good performance. If the bel canto singer is not creative and not capable of inventing his own variations and cadenzas and changing the line to just talk about the basic things, then he cannot sing this style. And this is a big challenge to today's artists who are not used to doing that. But we have, fortunately, more and more now people who are into this style, like Flores and Bartoli, just to say some of the most famous names, who really know about that and who are now creative artists recreating or recomposing the pieces they are singing, which is what the composer wanted them to do, and that is so important. I can't emphasize it often enough. We are working in the interest of the composer if we do add these things and change them. That is what he wanted us to do. But of course, we don't have complete freedom to do anything we want. What we today as serious artists want to do is try to find out again, what did the composer want us to do? If he would be living today, or if we would be living at that time, what would he have wanted us to do to create his music? So you need a lot of knowledge about the style of the time and what was allowed or expected and what was not done. And that is why you have to study this style. Fortunately, there are many books. It started in the Baroque time, 1723. There was the first treatise on singing by Tosi. He was a castrato, which is still important for our bel canto epoch. And then there was one by Mancini shortly after 1770. That is the time of young Mozart. Very interesting. He was also in Vienna, Mancini, who tell you quite exactly not just how to sing, but also how to recreate the score. And in the actual bel canto time, we have many, many treatises who tell us what you should do. So a good bel canto singer, and even more, of course, a conductor conducting bel canto, should know these books very well. Often they were by famous singers, like Lablache, that was the first Don Pasquale, for example. Cinti d'Amuro, she created all Rossini's operas in Paris, the French operas. Dupré was the first Edgardo in Donizetti's Lucia. He wrote a treatise on singing. But there is one book which is completely of central importance, and that is by Garcia. I have to talk a bit about this man, Garcia, Manuel Garcia. There are two Garcias, father and son. The father Garcia was one of the great tenors of the Rossini epoch, who really still had one foot in Baroque music, coming from there, going into the Rossini time, Manuel Garcia. He performed, or he created the role of Almaviva, the tenor role in Il Barbiere di Siviglia by Rossini. Garcia had 3 children. I'll make a kind of crescendo with it. The one was Pauline Viardot. She was the famous mezzo in Paris of the Meyerbeer epoch. Meyerbeer created all her operas for her. The other was Maria Malibran. She was one of the 2 greatest divas of the bel canto time. She had the importance of, in our time, Maria Callas or someone at least. Maria Malibran was the second child. And then he had a son who had the same name, Manuel Garcia, Junior. And this son, Garcia, was also expected to be a singer, but he discovered very soon, when he was about 22 or something, I think, that that was not his main interest and not his main talent. He was very interested in science, and he became the greatest singing teacher of the epoch. He also invented the laryngoscope, the instrument which the doctor uses to look into your throat. There are some disputes on this. Was he the very, very first one or the one who invented the best version of it? But you can say in some way that he invented that, and it gives you an idea of who he was. He was the greatest teacher of his time afterwards and is the authority on bel canto. And he wrote the most famous book on bel canto. It's called Traité complet de l'art du chant. It's in French because Paris was the cultural center of the world for most people then, and they all went to Paris to work. This book is still, for us, the center of the bel canto style, and we consult it when we want to know what was going on at that time. So we have as a source to know how to do bel canto Garcia's book. It's about half. He talks about technique in half of it, and in the other half, which is for us so interesting, he talks about the style, and he describes everything very, very exactly, almost scientifically, what you do and how you do it. So we have this book by Garcia as the most important book of many other ones. Then we also have recordings, but of course they start around 1900. Our bel canto epoch is 1800 to 1850. So there is no one from that epoch who made recordings. But as often in history, there are kind of transitional periods where old people teach young people, and there are young people who kind of have a part of one of their feet in the old times. So we do have some singers who made recordings who maybe give us a bit of an idea of how they were singing 2 generations before them. So we have some of these recordings. They are very interesting. We can't really count on them because, as I said, it's not the bel canto epoch anymore. This was the Verdi. They were all schooled in the Verdi epoch. And then the old recordings, as we know, don't give the very best idea of what it really sounded like. But you can learn a lot from that. I think more important are the books, to consult them and then try to find out yourself. But then we have a third way of getting back into this old time, which I think is the most interesting, and I want to talk about that a little bit because it touches me very personal. That is the so-called oral tradition. I want to start from the beginning and go back to the bel canto epoch, which, as we said, is about 1800 to 1850. 1850, Donizetti had been dead for just a few years, 3 or 4 years, I don't remember the dates exactly. Bellini a bit longer, but not more than something like 15 years, which isn't a long time. Verdi was young, still in his early period, more or less. So, in the year 1850, a young baritone whose name was Antonio Cotogni started his career in Rome, singing Donizetti's L'Elisir d'Amore. This baritone Cotogni, as a young singer, was continuously singing with older singers, together with older singers who had created the roles of Bellini and Donizetti. What is documented is that he sang in London, for example, which was then very, very international. He was singing with Giulia Grisi, who created Adalgisa in Bellini's Norma and created Norina and Don Pasquale. He was singing with Mario, the tenor who created Ernesto and Don Pasquale. And he even studied his roles with Antonio Tamburini, who sang most of the first performances for Bellini, working on them with Bellini. So he was singing together with these old singers as a young singer and was kind of breathing this atmosphere the whole time and got into his ears and into his blood how they were singing. He himself, when he was, I think, 35, he went to Paris to visit Rossini. He was still alive, but almost not composing anymore. And he gave us a complete description of his visit to Rossini, which is extremely interesting. And just to tell the main things, he was invited in, and Rossini asked him to sing. And they sang the duet Rosina Figaro from Barbieri di Siviglia together. Rossini was kind of marking Rosina, and Cottoni was really singing Figaro. And it starts with one thing, which is a perfect anecdote to illustrate a basic principle of bel canto. At the end of the recitativo, there is something which is in the score very simple, like Rosina, he asks her what is her name, and she says Rosina. But there's a kind of traditional play that he says, what is your name now? He says R-O, Ro, S-I-C. Ah, now you understand, Rosina. That has been a tradition for 150 years. And when they say this Rosina at the end, they used to do a trill, which is of course not in the score, and do Rosina, dunque o son, and then the duet starts. So Rossini asked Cottoni, when they came to this place, do you have a trill? And Cottoni said, no, I do, but it's not good. It sounds more like a goat doing bah, so I don't like to use it. And then Rossini said, fine, then please don't do it. But if you later can do a good trill, and I am sure you will learn this, then please do it in this place, because it makes a marvelous effect. And you have in this anecdote, you have the whole principle of bel canto, that you don't do anything which sounds bad, but if you can do something which sounds good and fits into the place and be creative on it, then you should do it. And this is a fantastic anecdote to illustrate the whole thing. And Cottoni did have a very good trill later. Verdi even composed one for him in Don Carlo. So that is that with the with the trill. And then they went through the duet, and then Cottoni sang the famous Largo al factotum for him, and he sang it with all the cadenzas he was used to doing on the fermata places and this kind of thing. And when he was ready, then Rossini said, bravo, that is exactly what I expect someone to do, to put in some variations, some cadenzas, but not too much, and keep in good taste. So we have a kind of guarantee by Rossini, from Rossini, that what Cottoni sang was what he wanted him to do and was in good taste. Cottoni became a teacher later. I'll talk about that in a moment. And we know exactly what Cottoni sang. His cadenzas were these famous, instead of, he did per un barbiere. And he also sang, instead of just doing la, 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 as in the score, he sang la, 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 a high note, la, 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 che bel vive. Then he sang also the cadenza, che bel piacere, which is not in the score. And at the end, he sang the high note. Instead of della città, he sang della città. And then he even sang with the, at the end, instead of just singing ta and just stopping, he did ta la 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 la. And so we have the complete version of how Cottoni sang this for Rossini, and Rossini's placet. That is what I want you to do. So that is Cottoni. Cottoni studied his roles with Tamburini, who sang the first performances for Bellini. He sang with all these Bellini Donizetti singers. He went to Rossini, got his advice. So his knowledge goes far, very, very, very far back. But the main thing, the important event in his life, was that he became really Verdi's baritone. Verdi had a tremendous esteem for him. No one has really written a doctor thesis on this yet and investigated exactly what, when, where did Cottoni work with Verdi. But we know that he, for example, sang the second performance of Forza del Destino with Verdi together, did all the rehearsals with him. And the most famous thing in his life was that he sang the first performance in Italian of Don Carlo. And there's a big story about this. The very first premiere was in French in Paris. Verdi wrote it for France. And Cottoni went there to listen to all the rehearsals, so he would know what Verdi had told the singers to do. So he learned all that. Then he went back and learned the Italian text. And before he sang the premiere, he went to Verdi's country place, Sant'Agata, and went through the whole role with him. So he got all these informations from Verdi, how he wanted him to sing his music. And then he sang the first performance in Bologna. So this is Cottoni, the most famous baritone of the Verdi epoch, who worked with Verdi and sang most of Verdi's roles with him together. Cottoni, when he got old, he was from Rome. He became the most famous singing teacher in Rome, one of the greatest singing teachers of Italy of all times. His pupils were, for example, Beniamino Gigli, Giacomo Laurivolpi, Mariano Stabile, Giuseppe De Luca. These are four of the greatest names in Italian opera. I think everyone knows Gigli in any case. So Cottoni was teaching in Rome as an old man. And in the year 1904, his pianist got sick, left him, whatever, couldn't continue working. He was looking for a new pianist. And so there was a young 12-year-old boy, and his father heard that Cottoni was looking for a pianist, and this boy was very gifted. So his father took him there, and this young boy was being introduced to Cottoni. There's also a complete story about this. They sat down, and Cottoni said, "Please sing together with me the Don Giovanni duet." La Girare in mano. Cottoni sang the baritone role. Ricci was supposed to play, and Mark the soprano role, to see if he could do this or not. So they did this, and it went quite well. Maybe some other things. And then Cottoni said, "Fine, very good. Please come tomorrow again, and let's continue." So Ricci was 12 years old. I said the name now, Luigi Ricci. He was 12 years old, and he played, I think, for 13 years, all the lessons which this famous baritone Cottoni gave privately and at the Accademia di Santa Cecilia in Rome, when Gigli and Laurivolpi and these people were studying with him. Ricci wrote down exactly everything what Cottoni told to his pupils, and that was, what did Verdi say to him? Or what did these old singers tell him that Bellini and Donizetti has said to them? Or what did Rossini say to him? This is the real tradition in Italian opera, the genuine one. So Ricci put all that into his scores. He himself, when he was mature, became the most famous coach in Italy. He was a kind of special case. You could not compare him to any other coach. The way he worked, but all this knowledge he had. And he himself played, for 8 years, he played all the rehearsals for Puccini in Rome and wrote down every word Puccini said to the singers. And even Puccini would change a lot and explain a lot. He also wrote a book on this. It's called Puccini Interprete di se stesso. How did Puccini interpret his own music? And as I said, Ricci was a completely unique coach in Italy, and virtually every singer up to something like 1960, I would say, had studied his roles with him. Gigli, for example, studied everything with him. Ricci, as Cottoni was extremely, how do you say in English, had an extremely good, well, he was just very precise and very modest, say it in that way, and would never change anything which one of these great composers had said to him or to Cottoni. So we can be sure that what he has given us as a tradition is really a genuine tradition also. I went to study with Ricci starting from about 1970, I think. And I went through I would say about 30 operas with him. Unfortunately, not more, because I didn't quite realize how old he was. I was something like 25, and he was something like 85. And I never thought that he would ever disappear. So I didn't try to go through everything, but I went through a lot of the classical Italian repertoire with him, most of the basic things, until at one point then he had to stop teaching, and then he did die after a year. But when I went to work with him, I would sit at the piano and play, and he would sit next to me and kind of conduct in his own way and sing with his 85-year-old man's voice, but with a tremendous expression. And he would just stop and then say, "Oh, senta, qui Puccini ha fatto così," or "Qui Cottoni mi ha detto che Verdi diceva così." So here in this place, Cottoni told me that Verdi had told him to sing like this, and then explain the whole thing. Or even farther back, "Qui Cottoni mi diceva che Tamborini," the old baritone, "diceva che Bellini aveva detto." And you get back, many, many generations, and had the feeling when he was teaching that Bellini, Rossini, and of course Verdi were just present in the room. And so this is the oral tradition, which is so important in Italian opera, all these things which are not written in the score. I have to say that Ricci was not primarily a bel canto teacher. If we think of Bellini, Donizetti, Rossini, this epoch, he was very much formed by his the singer he played for, Cottoni, who was primarily Verdi's baritone. And he had this tremendous respect for Verdi, of course. So when you do bel canto, the Ricci tradition is extremely important. Also for that reason, because he would not just write down something, he could sing it for you and show you how to do it, which is something different than reading it in a book. But when you go to the actual bel canto epoch, I think you have to make a combination of the Ricci tradition, which is very much formed by Verdi, which is a different way of thinking, and also go back to the old books and sources. That is what I try to do with the teaching, to keep the Ricci tradition and all its great values, but in addition go to the old books and do what you learn from them. But the Ricci oral tradition is priceless because he could, as I said, he could demonstrate how to do it. Yeah, so how do you study a bel canto opera? You must have to be able to sing bel canto properly and not just imitate other singers. You must have a great knowledge. So you must also study the old books and have your own theoretical fundament. I mentioned that you should not copy. That is one of the major things also. One of the big ideas, main ideas of the old style was, as I have said the whole time, that the singer was very important, much more important than nowadays, and that the audience went in every evening to hear what will this singer be doing. So the moment you copy another singer, you are not in the genuine bel canto style. You are expected to do something completely on your own, and in the best case, to do different things every evening. Every evening, a new creation of the piece, a different piece. So a bel canto singer today should not listen to Maria Callas or to any singer and copy them. He or she can get ideas from this, or also from the old books about what the old singers did. One can get an idea of what they did at that time, but you are expected to create your own variations and your own cadenzas. That, I think, is the most important thing, and you need knowledge for this. You have to know what the composer wanted you to do, and you have to get used to inventing cadenzas. You can also go to someone who helps you, of course. But we should go back to the principle that every bel canto performance is a new creation of the piece. But it's not a free creation. It is a creation within the frame of what this style was like and what the composer, which is always the main thing, what the composer wanted us to do. And that is what I try to convey in these bel canto courses, not just telling the singers, in this place you do this and this, but to try to give them the knowledge so they can find their own individual way of recreating the roles they are singing.